Hello there, welcome to another old course of mine that I'm uploading here. This time, because the course is still on sale, I'm not gonna upload it completely, just the most important parts. This course deals with 2D rendering, that is, using Inkscape to finish your pencil-made sketches, adding line, color, shadow, and everything else. It is one of the most common workflows that artists use with vector software, especially when working with cartoons. Because of the way the curriculum went, it made sense to me to separate the course into two parts. This part deals with some basic illustration techniques and tools that are not necessarily tied to rendering sketches and are more general purpose. So if you're not interested in that workflow of drawing in pencil and then finishing on Inkscape, everything I will show you here is still very relevant for any type of illustration. The next part, which will be the next video I'll upload, will cover the second part of the course and will deal with some more specific techniques related to rendering and finishing sketches. Though I will still recommend you to give it a watch, even if you don't use that workflow, because there is a lot of tools and techniques that can be useful to you. Well, that was everything I wanted to say. Have fun! Before we begin with the project, in the next few lessons, I want to show you some of the basic tools and techniques that we are going to be using all throughout this course. Pretty much everything of what I'll show you here. It's common to all vector illustration, not just game art. So if you've never worked with a vector software before, it's going to be especially important to get familiar with these concepts. In this lesson in particular, I want to start with one of the most important features of vector illustration, Boolean operations. I know I talked about Boolean operations in the Inkscape mini-course, but I showed you the mechanics of how to use them, not what they are actually used for in illustration. And this is what this lesson is all about. But before that, let me remind you really quickly what are Boolean operations. Boolean operations are a group of tools the program has that work by making two or more shapes interact and outputs a single path as a result. Boolean operations do not need to be performed with custom paths. They can be used with built-in shapes like ellipses or rectangles, but the resulting shape of the operation will always be a path. An important detail is that Boolean operations only work with shapes, built-in or custom, but not with other types of objects like imported images or groups. There are a total of 6 different operations that Inkscape brings in, but in practice only 3 of them are really necessary for most illustrations. They are the union, the difference, and the intersection. With that out of the way, let's begin with the union. The union will join all selected shapes into a single path, often used to create organic masses of objects like clouds or bushes. Creating organic shapes like this can be way faster than using the pen tool to draw the silhouette manually, and it gives you a lot more fine control and flexibility. Take a look at this cloud. If you pay attention to the silhouette, you'll see that it's actually made up of multiple ellipses overlapping. This is something that will be really easy to do using a union. So take the ellipse tool and draw a lot of ellipses overlapping to build the silhouette of the cloud. Now pick the object tool and select all the shapes. Go to Path, Union, or the really easy to remember shortcut, Ctrl and plus. Now the cloud is a single path, instead of being made of multiple ellipses. Now you can see and edit the nodes with the node tool. Now I'm sure you're thinking, why couldn't we just leave all the ellipses together, overlapping each other? Well, for once it's more comfortable to control an object made of a single shape, but the most important benefit of having a single path is that we can modify the silhouette of the shape, since it's a path. That is something we cannot do if there are a bunch of separated shapes together. Now, if you select the node tool, you can play around with the path and make the silhouette much more interesting. Like I said a minute ago, the union is perfect to build objects that have this organic bumpy silhouette, like clouds or bushes made of ellipses. But it can be used to build pretty much any complex shape that's made of multiple smaller, simpler shapes. And another common use will be to create mechanic looking shapes like cogs or man-made objects. The key question you should be asking yourself is if you need the multiple shapes to be a single path for whatever reason, and if they do, build it with a union. The Boolean difference will generate a shape that's the first shape minus all areas where intersected with the second shape. In other words, it lets you cut out or carve a shape by using another one. A couple of important differences with the union. First, you should only use two shapes. The difference does not work well with more than two shapes. And second, the shape that's gonna cut the other one should be above in the stack order. Let's go back to the example of the cloud. What if we want to make the classic cloud with a flat bottom? We could go in there and add and remove nodes manually and then adjust the bottom so it looks flat. But that's a lot of work for such a simple task. So the best way is to use a Boolean difference to cut out the lower part of the cloud. So grab the rectangle tool and draw where you want to cut. Adjust the shape carefully. It may be helpful to change the rectangle color so you can see better. And when you're done, go to Path, Difference, or the shortcut Ctrl and minus. Remember that this cloud shape is a new shape result of performing the difference with the other two shapes. I'm telling you because it may seem like it's the same object as before, because it has a similar form and it's in the same place. But if you perform a difference with a built-in shape, a new shape will be created in the same place that looks similar but that is a path and does not have the built-in modifiers. Also keep in mind that you could have used the pen tool to make the shape. Now here's an extremely common use for this operation, and it is creating a side shadow or highlight. Let's keep going with the cloud. What if we want to add some sort of rim highlight on top, as if the light is hitting the top part of the silhouette? This is something very common you see a lot in illustrations. Again, we could go in and do it manually, really slowly and really carefully, but that would be slow, inaccurate and tedious. So for that we are going to use a difference operation to create the shape of the highlight. Now the first step may seem a bit weird, but you have to duplicate the cloud shape 2 times. You'll see why in a minute. So select it and press Ctrl D twice. Remember that duplicating with Ctrl D will create an exact duplicate on top, so it looks like nothing happened, but there are 3 exact looking clouds stuck in the same place right there. For the next step, it will be very useful to change the color of the top duplicate, so you can see better what you're gonna do next. Now, the cloud directly below this top red cloud is gonna be cut down, and it's gonna become the highlight. So adjust this top red cloud so what's showing through of the cloud shape below has the form of the highlight you want. When you're happy with the result, select both shapes and perform the difference. The resulting shape may not be visible because it has the same color than the back cloud, so give it a nice whitish gray. Just to clarify if it's not clear, you need to duplicate twice, because all Boolean operations produce only one output shape, so we needed to generate the highlight shape with a copy so we could also keep the original cloud shape below. At the end of the day, differences are basically used to cut other objects. To me, it's easier to think of it as the scissors of the Boolean operations. Only that instead of a couple of blades, you use another path to cut what's below. Finally is the intersection operation. This operation is used to limit a shape to the inside of another, often to create shadows or highlights that are sharing a complex border, or to create patterns that need to be limited to the inside of a complex shape. For the sake of simplicity, let's continue with the theme of the clouds. Let's say that I want to create a nice looking shadow that gives some traces of volume. Notice that the silhouette of the cloud is actually fairly complex. The easiest way to create this type of highlights or shadows that are made with the pen tool and are not created by using the technique I showed you a minute ago with the difference operation is to use an intersection. It's super easy, just draw the shape you want with the pen tool on top of the cloud, and now very important, when you get to the outside area, Continue the shape so it covers completely the side the shadow is gonna go. We are gonna delete the excess, but the important thing is that this shape overlaps completely the side, so it won't show any holes once you perform the intersection. Now it's time to actually perform the intersection, but just like in the previous case with the difference, we want to create a new shape on top of the cloud, so duplicate the cloud shape with Ctrl D. Now the cloud copy is on top of the shadow we made, but that doesn't matter, the intersection doesn't care about the stack order, like the difference does. Select this duplicate and the shadow shape, and go to Path, Intersection, or use the shortcut Ctrl and asterisk. The resulting shape will fit exactly to the inside of the cloud shape. The important thing here is that in illustration, it's very frequent that you'll have to draw a shape that's one on top of another and needs to be constrained to the inside of a shape below. Not just in the case of shadows and highlights, that's the most frequent case, but there are other uses. And that's all you need to know about using Boolean operations in practice. Boolean operations are some of the most common operations that you'll be doing all the time, so I strongly suggest you to really wrap your head around what you've seen in this lesson. Play around and practice on your own till these concepts become second nature, because they really are an essential part of all vector illustration. And one last thing, I believe that just like with the Mind for tools, you should, as soon as possible, start using shortcuts instead of the menu. So get used to performing the operations using the shortcuts. They are quite easy to remember, and they are essential to working at a good, comfortable pace. Okay, now let's continue with the tools and techniques of vector illustration, with a couple of really important features to handling groups of objects. First of all, I want to talk about groups. You can group multiple objects so they handle as if they were a single object. This will help you a lot when you are dealing with an illustration filled with objects and you have problems selecting a group of shapes that are meant to be a single thing. Like for example, this cloud is made of three different shapes: the base cloud shape, the highlight shape, and the shadow shape. But the three shapes makes up a single thing, a cloud. If we were working in a real-life composition with a ton of nearby objects, dragging a rectangle to only select these three shapes may not be as easy as you would like. So the solution will be to group these three objects, so select them all and hit Ctrl G. You see that the three outlines that indicated that the three objects were selected becomes one. Now you can make any manipulation as if these three shapes were a single one. However, at any moment you can double click on this group and then you'll enter the group. You can see that you've entered a group because you'll see this weird text in the current layer dropdown in the status bar. This dropdown displays the currently active layer, but when you enter the group, will display the name of the group. The weird text is the default name Inkscape gives the groups. Now that you've entered the group, you can modify the shapes as if the group never was created. You can modify the individual shapes, edit them, delete them, and even create new ones that will belong to the group. After you're done editing the group, you can double-click in any free place in the canvas to leave the group. Again, you'll see that the weird text changed back, and it should display the layer name. All changes that you made to the group will be kept. If at any moment you want to ungroup a group, you can simply select it and hit Ctrl-Shift-G. A couple of notes about the behavior of groups. First, the Node tool bypasses any group. I guess that this is a feature to simplify the editing of the contents of a group, so you don't have to enter first if you want to quickly adjust something inside. Second, and this is important, you cannot perform Boolean operations with groups. The program won't allow it. This behavior can be a bit of a pain when building more complex shapes, because groups are really useful to handle the complexity and organize objects, and Boolean operations are some of the most common operations you'll be doing. For this reason only, I tend to avoid using too many groups if the object I'm drawing is manageable. I talked about clips in the Inkscape mini tutorial, but just like with the Boolean operations, I didn't went into the actual uses for illustration or the more important details. I'm assuming that you watched that lesson or that you are at least familiar on how to create clips, so I'm not gonna go over the basics here. Rewatch that lesson if you forgot about how to create clips. However, as a quick refresher, clips allows you to limit the visibility of an object to the silhouette of another object. If this description sounds a bit familiar, it's because it fulfills a similar purpose than the illustration, but with a couple of really important changes. First, clips do not generate a new shape like the intersection. It just limits the visibility of the target shape. So you can still edit the clip shape inside and have way better control of how an object looks. And second, while the intersection, being a Boolean operation, only works with paths, clips work with pretty much everything. Paths, groups, imported images. You can even use groups as clipping shapes themselves, which is tremendously useful at times. As you can imagine, this opens up a lot of new possibilities. So let me show you an example. If I wanted to add this pattern to the cloud using an intersection, I would have to dismantle this pattern, ungroup it and move each path into the right position, then perform an operation with each of the 8 shapes, one by one, being careful that the overall pattern do not get destroyed in the process. It will be a ridiculous amount of work for such a simple task. Luckily, clips can be used with groups. So first, make sure the pattern is a group. Select all shapes and hit Ctrl G. Now put the pattern on top of the cloud. Duplicate the cloud and perform a simple clip with it. Because the clip pattern is a group, you can enter the pattern group and easily move the shapes, modify them, and even add new objects without fear of leaving the silhouette of the cloud. It's really powerful. Another common use will be to use them as a way to add bitmap textures to a path. Since clip work with imported images, all you have to do is to put it on top of the shape you want, duplicate the bottom shape, and perform the clip with the texture. Now you should play around with the opacity and maybe add a blend effect or something to make it look nicer. All this power that clips brings in may make you think that you should use clips only and completely forget about intersections. After all, everything that you can do with an intersection, you can do it with a clip in a more flexible way. Well, in practice there are a couple of inconveniences that clips brings in. One big example is that, just like with groups, using clips with Boolean operations is a bit tricky. The difference with groups is that you are able to perform the operation if the clip only has paths, but the problem is that since a clip function is to only hide parts of an object, the operation will be performed with the full shape, not only with the visible parts. On the other hand, if a clip is made with a group, the operation will not perform. And if you're working in a more complex drawing with a lot of shapes, it may end up being a bit complicated to identify which object is not letting the Boolean operation to execute. So in practice I try to be as careful as I can both with groups and clips, because they can seriously complicate you in the long run. So my recommendation is that you should try to at least not use them in completely unnecessary places. As a rule of thumb, I always use intersections for simple and quick shapes that I can remake in a minute if I want, and I use clips for the more complex shapes. And of course for every time I need to clip a group or an image. This way I minimize the amount of clips as much as I can, and the drawing is a bit cleaner. In this lesson I want to talk very quickly about the basics of light and shadow, and how to apply those concepts to your Inkscape illustrations. We can think of an object as having two types of color. First is the local color. This is the actual color that the object is painted. Could be red, yellow, greenish blue, or a combination of multiple colors. And then is the illumination color on top. Let me explain. In real life, when light hits a surface, it makes its color lighter. A red surface directly hit by the sun will have a lighter shade of red than the rest of the surface in shadow. And the same if the color of the surface is yellow or greenish blue or any other color you may think. How light that surface will be depends on how directly the light rays are hitting the surface. That is, how much a surface is pointing at the light source. Our brains are programmed to quickly and effortlessly identify different shades of lightness of one tone as different planes in an object. This way, by giving your object the right shade of a color, you can imply volume. Now, in real life, most objects with round surfaces, that is, non-man-made objects, have surfaces that transition softly between light and shadow. But since we are working with a cel-shaded cartoon style, we can easily stylize these light and shadow areas in easy-to-draw hard shapes like these ones. Now, how many of these hard illumination shapes you create depends on the style you're working. In some cartoons you'll see 3 or more light and shadow shapes that simplifies illumination but gives a lot of depthness. In some others you don't even see any separation between lightness areas. That depends on the style you're going for. Of course, there is more complexity to light and shadow, but for our purposes that's all we need to know for now. So to summarize, a highlight will have the same color than the local color of the object, but lighter, and the shadow will have the same color than the local color, but darker. Okay, so let me show you how to apply these theories using Inkscape. Take a look at this red circle. I want to imply a light roughly coming from the top left side. So very quickly I'll draw a highlight on top where the light rays in the area will be hitting stronger, and a shadow shape below roughly where the light rays wouldn't be hitting the area directly. Of course, both using the intersection technique that we saw in the previous lesson. I'll start with the shadow. Remember, the shadow has the same color than the local color, but darker. So I'll select it. Make sure I'm in the Fill tab, and here I got a decision to make. Which one of these 5 color selection modes I'll use? If you watched the Inkscape tips lesson, there I say that I always recommend to using the HSL mode, since it's a mode that I believe it's better for illustration in general. In the HSL mode you have the same colors than in the other modes, but the difference is that you select the colors by selecting the hue, saturation and lightness by separate, using separated sliders. As you can imagine, this works like a charm for us. We have a separate slider that we can use to handle the illumination, the L slider, which handles the lightness. So what I'll do is to use the dropper tool here. The default shortcut is D. I'll sample the local colors so they are the same now. Go to the L slider and start to slightly lower it so the shadow is now a darker tone of red. Of course, now I'll do the same for the highlight, but instead I'll slightly move the L slider up till I get a lighter red. One little note here. Remember that we are working with highly stylized cartoons here, so there is no need to be physically exact with the colors. Just eyeball which shade darker or lighter you think will fit your shadow or highlight, and it'll look okay. Now I can repeat the same step with these different color circles. The method is the same, just sample the color and move slightly the L slider to one side or the other, depending on if you're making the highlight or shadow. A couple of things. First, we could have used any of the other color selection modes to set the color. It's because it is way more comfortable and easier to use a slider to control the lightness of a color individually from the other properties. but there is no reason why you couldn't have used any of the other modes if you know what you're doing. At the end of the day, what you want is to keep a similar hue and saturation, but lower or higher, and you can do that with any of the other color modes, just not as easily. The other issue is that this method of sampling the local color and then moving the slider only work when the highlight or shadow is going through a surface of the same color. If you have an object made of multiple colors, then we have a problem. Well, let me show you a quick technique to quickly make light and shadow shapes that will affect equally all colors. And for this, we're gonna use a nice property of digital colors, and that is transparency. First, of course, make the highlight and shadow shape. Now for the highlight, give it a completely white color. Now in the HSL dialog, you'll see a fourth slider with the label A. A stands for alpha, that is the transparency of the color. Lower the transparency quite a bit, almost to 1/3 down. There's no formula here. Just play around with the slider till the highlight interacts the way you want with the colors below. As you can see, because the color is white and transparent, it's adding to the other colors white and giving a pretty good effect of being a highlight. Now, I think you know what to do with the shadow. It's the exact same process, only this time you should use a full black instead of white. Again, play around with the opacity until it looks good with all the colors below. This method of using black and white colors with transparency also has the advantage that you can change the color below and both the highlight and shadow will adapt pretty well. So you can make the highlight and shadow shapes once and then play around changing the local color and experimenting and see what looks good. But remember, different colors have different natural lightness, so the alpha transparency that looks good in one color may require adjusting in another color. Also remember that generally shadows looks better than highlights using this method. One quick thought here, I'm sure you're wondering if you could just use this black and white transparency method to create highlights and shadows always and completely forget about the direct color method I showed you first. Well, you certainly could, but the problem is that when you're using this method, you're not picking the actual colors. You are tinting other objects' colors. So you lose a lot of control over simply being able to pick the color you want. For example, it's very common that on top of making a highlight lighter, also adjust the hue just a bit to make the colors more rich and variated. The same with the shadows. If you're working with a color with transparency, you can still select a hue that will influence the colors below, but you're gonna need to go back and forth and waste a lot of time experimenting trying to get the results you want. There are other ways to add shadows and highlights that look slightly better by using blend modes, but that's a bit more difficult to implement and it doesn't look that better in my opinion. In other words, sometimes it's easier to simply give the highlight or shadow a direct color, especially since adjusting colors is not a particularly slow process. So, as a rule of thumb, I prefer to always use direct color when I'm working with simple objects where it's easy to go in and change colors quickly. And I use the transparency method when there is a ton of highlights and shadow shapes, and it could be difficult to go in and adjust things one by one. Or when it's a single object made of multiple objects of different colors, and it will simplify the things a lot.